Imagine waking up every morning knowing you owe money, but no one can ever find out. Imagine going to work, smiling at people, answering emails, attending meetings, while inside your head there's only one thought repeating over and over again. How did this get so out of control? Now imagine checking your bank account before getting out of bed, feeling your heart race before the screen even loads, because deep down you already know what you're going to see. That's my life right now. My name doesn't really matter, but I'm 45 years old, and until recently, I truly believed I had everything under control. I've always been the responsible one, the stable one, the guy who pays bills on time, the guy who works hard, the guy who doesn't take unnecessary risks. At least, that's what everyone thinks. For almost 20 years, I built what I thought was a safe and predictable life, a steady job, a routine, a reputation for reliability. Nothing extraordinary, but secure. And for a long time, that was enough. But something started changing a few years ago. Not all at once. Slowly, almost invisibly. It started with small expenses, then unexpected ones, then moments where I told myself, I'll fix this next month. And I really believed that. At first, it was just a credit card balance that didn't fully get paid. Then another card. Then a personal loan to organize everything. That's the lie most people don't realize they're telling themselves when debt begins to grow. You don't think you're getting deeper. You think you're solving the problem. But I wasn't solving anything. I was just buying time. And time turned out to be the most expensive thing I could borrow. The strange part is that my life, from the outside, never looked different. I kept working, kept showing up, kept acting normal. No one noticed anything, not my coworkers, not my friends, not even my family, because I made sure they wouldn't. Every month became a quiet strategy game. Which bill could wait? Which payment could be split? Which card still had a little limit left? And every time I moved numbers around, I felt temporary relief. But that relief never lasted, because the total kept growing. And eventually, something else started changing too. My mind. I stopped sleeping well. I started waking up in the middle of the night thinking about due dates. Numbers began following me everywhere, at work, driving home, even during conversations. And that's when I realized something I didn't want to admit. This wasn't just a financial problem anymore. It was becoming a mental one. But I still didn't tell anyone, because admitting the truth would mean admitting something else. That I'd lost control, and for someone like me, that was the hardest part. So I kept pretending, kept working, kept hiding, until the day one notification changed everything. And that was the moment I understood. This situation was much bigger than I thought. The notification came on a Tuesday morning while I was already sitting at my desk pretending to focus on a spreadsheet, and at first I ignored it because I had trained myself to ignore anything related to money during work hours. But something about the subject line made my chest tighten before I even opened it. And when I finally did, I felt that strange, cold sensation that starts in the stomach and spreads slowly through the body. The message said that my payment was officially overdue and that further action could be taken if the balance wasn't resolved soon. And even though the tone was formal and neutral, my mind translated it into something much louder and more threatening, something personal, something final. And from that moment on, I couldn't read a single number correctly on my screen because every number started turning into the same thought. Debt, debt, debt. I tried to continue working like nothing had happened, but I noticed I was rereading the same email 3 or 4 times without understanding it. And then I opened another tab to check my bank account, even though I already knew what it looked like. And when I saw the balance, my heart started beating faster, not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet, constant pressure that makes it hard to breathe normally. And that was the first time I realized my financial problem had officially entered my professional life in a way I couldn't separate anymore. Before that day, I still believed I could keep both worlds apart, work on one side, personal problems on the other. But stress doesn't respect those boundaries. It leaks through small cracks, and mine were getting bigger. Over the next few weeks, I started making small mistakes. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make me uncomfortable because I've always been detail-oriented, always careful, always reliable. Yet suddenly I was missing deadlines by a few hours, forgetting attachments, needing colleagues to repeat instructions that normally would have been simple for me, and every mistake made me more anxious because I wasn't just. I didn't notice exactly when the emotional distance started turning into something visible, but I remember the night it became impossible to pretend it wasn't happening anymore. It was a normal evening, nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, which is probably why it affected me so deeply, because I've realized that the most painful moments rarely arrive with noise. They arrive quietly inside ordinary routines. I was sitting on the couch after dinner, holding my phone without really looking at it, scrolling automatically while my mind kept replaying numbers and deadlines like it had been doing for months, and I could feel that familiar mental fog that had started following me everywhere. The kind that makes you present physically but absent emotionally. And I didn't even notice how silent I had become until she asked me a simple question that should have been easy to answer. She asked, "Are you okay?" And the way she said it wasn't casual, it wasn't automatic, it was slow and careful, like someone who had been observing something for a long time and finally decided to say it out loud. I remember lifting my eyes and realizing she wasn't looking at the television. She was looking directly at me, and in that moment I felt exposed in a way I hadn't felt before. Not because she knew about the debt, but because she knew something inside me wasn't right. My first instinct was automatic denial, the same response I'd been giving myself for months. I said, "Yeah, I'm just tired." And for a few seconds there was silence again. But this time it felt heavier, because I realized she didn't believe me. The strange part is that she didn't push. She didn't ask more questions. She didn't argue. And that made everything worse because her silence felt like understanding without information, like she could sense the weight without knowing the details. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual, not because I was sleepy, but because I didn't want to risk another question I wasn't ready to answer. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I felt something shift inside me for the first time since all of this had started. Until that moment, my biggest fear had been losing financial control. Then it became losing professional stability. But now a new fear appeared quietly and settled deeper than the others. The fear of losing emotional connection with the person closest to me. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of small details I'd been ignoring, like how often I said later when. Conversations involved future plans, how frequently I changed the subject when money came up, how many times I pretended to be distracted when I was actually just afraid. And once I started noticing these patterns, I couldn't stop seeing them everywhere. At work, things weren't improving either. I was still functioning, still delivering what was required, but everything required more effort than before. Simple tasks felt mentally heavy, and I noticed I was becoming quieter in meetings, not because I had nothing to say, but because my confidence was slowly eroding under the constant pressure I was carrying alone. There was one specific afternoon that still feels very clear in my memory, because it was the first time my professional reality and my hidden financial reality collided directly. I received an internal email about a possible restructuring within our department. Nothing confirmed, nothing immediate, just organizational adjustments. But the moment I read it, my body reacted before my mind could rationalize anything. My chest tightened and my breathing became shallow, and I suddenly realized how fragile my sense of stability had become. Before all of this, an email like that would have been just information, something neutral, but now it felt like a threat, because I knew I didn't have emotional or financial space to absorb any unexpected change. That afternoon, I didn't produce anything meaningful at work. I kept switching between tabs, checking numbers, opening the same documents repeatedly without actually processing them, and that was the moment I recognized something I had been avoiding for months. I wasn't just stressed anymore. I was exhausted in a deeper way, a kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending for too long. Later that evening, when I arrived home, everything felt normal again on the surface. dinner, conversation, routine. But inside me, there was a growing awareness that the strategy I had been using, silence, was no longer protecting me. It was isolating me. I started thinking about the timeline of everything, trying to remember when the first hidden balance appeared, when the first, "I'll fix this later" thought happened, when the first moment of avoidance felt easier than honesty, and what scared me most was realizing there wasn't a single turning point. It had all happened gradually through small decisions, small delays, small rationalizations that didn't feel dangerous at the time. But something else was beginning to emerge beneath that fear, something subtle and still fragile, a small awareness that maybe the real damage wasn't the debt itself. Maybe it was the isolation I had built around it. The moment that finally broke something inside me didn't happen at work, and it didn't happen when I looked at the numbers again. It happened on a completely ordinary Saturday morning, the kind of morning that usually feels safe and predictable. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I wanted to, but because my mind had already started running before my body had fully rested. And for a few minutes, I just stayed there staring at the ceiling, feeling that familiar pressure sitting quietly in my chest. The house was silent, and I could hear small sounds from the kitchen, cabinet doors opening softly, the coffee machine starting, the subtle rhythm of a normal routine continuing without interruption. We sat at the table together, and for a few minutes we talked about small things, weekend plans, groceries, nothing important. And yet every word felt heavier than it should have because I knew there was something sitting between us that only I could see. Then, in a completely casual tone, she opened her phone and said something that seemed harmless at first. She mentioned that she had been thinking about planning a short trip later in the year. Nothing expensive, just a few days to rest because we hadn't traveled in a long time. The moment she said that, something inside me tightened instantly. Not because of the trip itself, but because I knew that even a small, unexpected expense now felt impossible in my current situation. I felt my brain switching into that automatic defensive mode again, searching for excuses, delays, vague responses, anything that could push the conversation forward without exposing the reality I had been hiding. I said something like, "Yeah, maybe later this year," trying to sound neutral, but my voice came out slightly slower than normal, and I could feel that she noticed. She didn't react immediately. She just looked at me for a few seconds longer than usual, and then she asked a question that was still simple but carried a completely different weight. She asked, "Why do you always say later lately?" That sentence stayed suspended in the air between us, and for the first time, I didn't have an automatic answer ready. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, and in that silence, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel fully until that moment. The exhaustion of pretending. It wasn't the fear of the debt itself anymore. It was the emotional fatigue of carrying a hidden version of my life every single day. She didn't sound suspicious. She didn't sound accusatory. She sounded concerned, and somehow that made everything heavier because concern is harder to deflect than confrontation. I looked down at my coffee just to avoid eye contact for a few seconds, and while I stared at that surface slowly cooling, my mind replayed the past months all at once. The late nights checking balances, the small transfers between accounts trying to buy time, the constant internal promises that I would fix everything before anyone noticed. And then a realization hit me quietly but deeply. Someone had already noticed, not the numbers, not the details, but the emotional weight those numbers had been placing on me. I suddenly understood that while I'd been working so hard to hide the financial reality, I hadn't been able to hide the emotional consequences of it. My silence, my hesitation, my lack of presence, they had all been visible long before the truth itself. That realization didn't come with clarity or relief. It came with confusion and a strange sense of vulnerability, because for the first time, I wasn't just afraid of losing control financially or professionally. I was afraid of losing trust emotionally. I remember nodding slightly, not as an answer, but as a way to buy myself a few seconds to think. And she kept looking at me patiently, waiting without pressure. which somehow made the moment even more intense. Inside my head, there was a conflict happening that felt louder than any external conversation. The part of me that wanted to finally speak, and the part of me that still believed I needed to solve everything first before admitting anything. I could feel both sides pulling at the same time, and that internal tension made my chest feel tight in a way that wasn't dramatic, just heavy and constant. I ended up saying something vague again, something about work stress and recent responsibilities, and she accepted the explanation with a small nod, but I could sense that the conversation hadn't really ended. It had only been postponed. And as the day went on, I realized something that stayed with me long after that moment at the kitchen table. The hardest part was no longer the debt itself. The hardest part was understanding that hiding it had slowly been changing who I was becoming.